Today on Inside the Issues, I speak to Mukesh Kapila on Darfur and the situation in Sudan. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm CIGI Senior Fellow Barry Carin, and I'm very happy to be this week's guest host. Every week we welcome an expert in international public policy, global governance, or some aspect of international affairs to the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Today, we welcome Mukesh Kapila. Mukesh Kapila is a veteran of conflicts and disasters from Afghanistan to Bosnia, from Rwanda to North Korea, from Burma to Sierra Leone. He has been there, witnessing the worst that man and nature can do. Along the way, he has served in senior positions in the British government, in the United Nations, in the World Health Organization, and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations. This leads me to my first question. Mukesh, you were the top UN official, UN resident, and humanitarian aid coordinator in Sudan during the Darfur conflict. What did you find when you got there?
When I was appointed to be the UN chief of Sudan, the expectation was that I would be presiding or bringing peace to what was Africa's longest running conflict in the continent's biggest country at that time, and that had generated the world's largest numbers of refugees and displaced. Sudan had been at war within itself ever since it got independent in the 1950s. And over the long period, much suffering had taken place. But we had a historic opportunity in 2003 to bring that to the end, because the Islamic government in the north in Khartoum and the rebel movement in the south, led by John Garang, had fought themselves to a standstill. And for once, the world was united in helping the two parties to come to a sensible resolution of the long-standing conflict. And I, as the head of the United Nations in the Sudan, was expected to help usher in a new chapter in Sudan's life, build peace and reconciliation, foster reconstruction, and then promote the development of this great land. Unfortunately, soon after I got there in April 2003, reality got in the way. And that new reality was the outbreak of war in a little-known region called Darfur. Darfur is the size of France. It's 1,000 kilometers or more west of Khartoum, and even at the best of times, somewhat forgotten. But it soon became clear to us that there was a new process going on there. A group calling themselves the Sudan Liberation Army had attacked government installations, the forces in Darfur. And before we know where we were, there was a major conflagration going on. This had a huge effect on the peace process and the original plan to settle the historic conflicts. When I investigated what was going on in Darfur, it was clear that this wasn't just another one of the numerous insurgencies that was troubling this land, and indeed the continent, but there were some very special features to it. The special features were that the Sudan government, led by al-Bashir, was orchestrating a genocidal solution to the dissatisfaction of the people there. So we had targeted attacks by Sudanese military and Sudanese authorities on groups of black African tribal origin in Darfur, with the intention to eliminate the refugees and displaced that are pouring out of Darfur rapidly over the following few weeks, made it clear that a new dynamic was prevailing in Sudan, and the peace process was nowhere in sight.
Well, why didn't the United Nations intervene?
Well, the UN leadership at that time, it was Kofi Annan time in office, was reluctant to get involved. The backdrop, the international backdrop was, of course, the war in Iraq, where the Western powers were trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein. This is 2003. And the great powers were clearly reluctant to open another front in another country, especially as there were reports of good intelligence cooperation between Sudan and the Western powers in relation to al-Qaeda and so on. That was one factor. Another factor was that there was a reluctance to believe what was going on. So despite all the evidence that I was bringing to the leadership of the United Nations, and not just to Kofi Annan, but also to the great powers, I went to London, I went to Washington, I went to Paris, and all the Security Council countries in the West, they were not wanting to believe that what was going on in Darfur at the time was a massive ethnic cleansing operation.
We'll be back in a moment with Mukesh Kapila. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back, Mukesh. Mukesh, what are the reasons why we fail to prevent these things?
That's the key question. Now, I've had the misfortune to witness the last genocide of the 20th century in Rwanda and Srebrenica, as I was saying. And as the head of the UN, I found myself dealing with the first genocide of the 21st century. And as I went around the world, trying to draw the attention of the most powerful countries to what was going on, in addition to, of course, talking to Sudanese authorities themselves, the government I was accredited to, as to why, when we knew so much about what was going on in Darfur. Remember that this was the first mass atrocity of the global media age. In other words, I had access to satellite images, I had access to smartphone technology, we had emails, and we had social media like Facebook and such, and so on and so on. Unlike previous genocides, for example in Rwanda, which took place in the darkness, or in the Holocaust in the Second World War, where we learned a lot, but only after the event. In Darfur, the first genocide of the media age, we have the distinction of having recorded everything as it was happening. So the alibi which existed in previous mass atrocity incidents, that is, oh, we didn't know what was going on, could no longer apply. The second alibi, which was often applied in other circumstances, that the senior-most people in the world, the leaders of our international community, were not personally aware, made aware of what was going on, was also no longer was not true in the case of Darfur, because being a senior government official from the British government and being well connected professionally to all the leading governments of the world and so on and so forth, as I traveled to world capitals and told them my story about what I was witnessing in Darfur, I was speaking to the highest ministers in those particular countries.
Well, Mukesh, if they didn't have those alibis of not knowing, why wasn't there some action?
A number of reasons. The first and principal reason was cynicism. And this was told to me by a European country foreign minister. You know, what do you expect? This is Sudan, where people have been fighting each other for a very, very long period of time. These natives, they've been murdering and slaughtering each other. You know, they'll come to their senses one day. You know, forget about it. You know, we've got other things to do. First reason. The second reason it was given to me was futility in another European nation, this time as a development minister. And she said to me, oh, well, it's all over, isn't it? And this is what I call the futility of helplessness. The genocide is over. The ethnic cleansing is finished. What's the point of intervening now? Let's move on. Third excuse was denial in another country. Surely the situation is not as bad as you say, Mukesh. You know, you are exaggerating to gain attention. We know you. You're a kind of histrionic character, and you want money for the UN, and that's why you're making up all these stories. Denial. It's not as bad. The fourth excuse was ambiguity, and this was in one of the Middle Eastern countries. Well, is this genocide? Is this this? Is this that group fighting that group? And I'm not sure this is that or the other. Just fudging and graying the issue. The fifth excuse one got, and this was within the United Nations system, prevarication. You got to be patient, Mukesh. It takes time to study these problems. This country has been in an internal war for decades. And we will set up a committee, a commission. We will send a special representative. We'll investigate. We'll ask academics, and reports will be written. be patient, prevaricate. The sixth excuse was risk aversion. Well, you know, this Bashir guy, he has a reputation for being pretty nasty. If we kind of make him even crazier by condemning him, he might accelerate his mass murder, and we might make the matters worse. Or, by the way, if we intervene as the UN, our staff will be at risk. So risk aversion. The seventh excuse I was given was distraction. You know, it's true, and you know this, Barry, from your own high positions we occupied in the Canadian government and my own role in high position in British government, that we might call this the inertia of busyness. The busier you get as a policymaker, and the more senior you get, the more difficult the problems are that percolate up to your table, because, you know, if they weren't difficult, they'd be solved at a lower level. So when you are at the high tables of policy, you're dealing with the world's nastiest problems. And of course, you're the same person, you're the same Barry. And the way you deal with this is by shuffling your problems. You set up a committee there, you send the representative there, you talk to someone there, and you shuffle the problems around on your table. And this is the way you give the illusion of handling them. And this is what I call the inertia of busyness. The seventh excuse I got was, the eighth excuse I got was buck passing. Well, I'm not sure this is our problem. You know, let the Africans sort it out. African solutions for African problems. Or I think the Arab League should be involved. Or, by the way, the British have some knowledge historically about Khartoum. Maybe let's turn to the Brits to do this. Buck passing, evasion of responsibility. The ninth excuse I got was what I call purity seeking. Well, what happens is that when a conflict like this starts, there are good guys and there are bad guys, usually. Then as time passes on and the rhetoric mounts up, the good and the bad get blurred. So who did what to whom gets merged into each other. And as time passes, people say, well, your both sides are as bad as each other. Plague on all your houses. And no one is pure. Therefore, there is no point in actually intervening amongst equally bad guys. And then you lose sight of the historic sources of the grievances.
Is there one more reason?
There are a couple of more reasons. One is the deference to authority and specificity aversion. Activists get on the scene. They say they condemn human rights violations, abuses, and so on. But they don't actually give any specific recommendations. I'm nearly there. Then there is what I call calculated naivety. You kind of go and study the situation, and then you say, but you know, things look all right here. People are getting their humanitarian aid and so on. I don't know what you're talking here about. And finally, and the most important of all reasons, Barry, is what I call the empathy deficit. As long as policymakers and public and opinion makers don't feel the pain themselves of the worst afflicted populations, it just becomes an intellectual game of international politics or real politics, or the great game as it used to be called in the old days. And hence it becomes an academic distraction, and the tragedies go on and on. So these 12 reasons in various combinations is why the world neglected the unfolding genocide in Darfur.
We'll be back in a moment with Mukesh Kapila. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Well, Mukesh, as I understand it, in your official UN position, you notified the UN, your superiors, you took the case to the Sudanese government, you publicized the event to the various important governments around the world. No action. What was the tipping point for you in deciding to take the crimes against humanity being perpetrated in the Sudan? What was the tipping point that caused you to take it to the public, to become a whistleblower?
Yes, as you say, I did my job as a diplomat and tried to draw the world's attention to what is going on using my access to the greatest powers and my own United Nations hierarchy. So one day, frustrated by all these efforts and a complete failure in one sense, I was sitting in my office in Khartoum, and heard a big noise outside. And after some time, my assistant ushered in a young woman called Ayesha in the book I've written. And she came into the office and then told me her personal story of what had happened to her. She came from a place in North Darfur. She was a teacher in her late 20s. And she described in heart-piercing detail her own personal story of how she had been raped in front of her husband, her father, her children, her neighborhood, along with another 100 or so women in this place called Tawila. And she went into graphic detail on what a mass industrial rape scene looks like, with her as one of the victims. And the rapes were committed by the Janjaweed militia, in support of whom were Sudanese military in official Sudanese military uniforms, with Sudanese military vehicles nearby and helicopters on standby, etc. So it was quite clear that what was going on was an officially sanctioned attempt by the Sudanese government. My diplomatic efforts having failed, and governments around the world being deaf to me, there's only one thing left for me to do. And that is that if the world's governments would not speak to me, I would speak to the world's peoples. And the only way to do that was through the world media. And so that's what I did. I spoke initially to the BBC in an exclusive interview that I gave in Nairobi, because there's no free media in Khartoum. And I did it at a time when my bosses in New York would be fast asleep, so that they wouldn't be able to stop me. And because I was the United Nations chief, it was news. And that taught me a very important lesson. It is not what you say, but the platform from which you say it that is important. I mean, I think if a trained monkey had been put on that particular platform with a label in front of him saying UN coordinator and spout what I did, it would have been world news, you see. But basically what I said was this was the world's greatest humanitarian crisis, which it was at that time. It was a human rights catastrophe on a par with Rwanda. We were on the 10th anniversary. This was now March 2004, and which is almost the 10th anniversary of Rwanda. And then that the government of Sudan was responsible for these mass atrocities and ethnic cleansing. When that hit the world's press, it was news all over the world. And by the time Kofi Annan woke up in New York, it was a done deal in that it had gone all around the world. So the whistle had been blown.
So how did the United Nations react?
Well, I was expecting them to either censor me deeply or to vigorously defend me. What actually happened was neither, in that there was just complete and utter silence. It was as if nothing had happened.
Your paycheck kept coming.
My paycheck kept coming for a little while. It stopped eventually, but that's another story. But there was, I think, New York, the UN system was in shock. And the whole, not just the UN Secretariat, because only a few weeks before, I had been in New York pleading with Security Council countries to allow this matter to be discussed in the Security Council, because this was a threat to international peace and security, with allegations of Eritrean involvement, Libyan involvement, and hundreds of thousands of refugees flowing into neighboring countries like Chad and Central African Republic. And what was the point of the Security Council? If it could not discuss Africa's longest running conflict, no one had ever discussed Sudan in the Security Council for generations, as far as I know, you see. So in a sense, by blowing the whistle, I had completely disrupted the established order of the UN. And then, you know, what happened was that, of course, the media got hold of the story and would not let go, and therefore the institution of the UN had to respond.
That's a sad story. Do you think they've learned any lessons from this? I mean, this is very similar to the failure to react in Rwanda. Is there any indication that some positive lessons have been learned?
Well, certainly there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I mean, one lesson, for example, the critical lesson, is that one person can make a difference, and that the position you occupy is important. If an important person speaks up, it makes more of an impact. And my speaking up as the head of the UN made an impact in the fact that the UN process got underway. But imagine if Kofi Annan 3 months before had spoken up, or imagine if a world leader had done that a few weeks ago when I was going around giving them the information. Maybe, though bad things would have happened in Darfur, it wouldn't have gone on to the extreme that I eventually witnessed. And so the lesson is that early warning isn't enough. We had all the early warning we wanted, but that early action is needed. But for early action, you need courage. And the critical question for me in the failure of the United Nations, in the failure of foreign ministers around the world, in the failure of my own government in Britain, in a way, is that these institutions are inhabited by cowards. And it's the institutions that let us down, but the institutions are by themselves without a personality. It is the people who shape the policies and leadership of the institution that let us down. So the lesson for us is, why are our institutions become more and more cowardly and led by cowards as time has gone by? You see, and we need to recapture these institutions for the purpose for which they were originally invented, particularly the United Nations.
We'll be back in a moment with Mukesh Kapila. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Mukesh, the cowardice, those are very strong words. How do you assess the performance of Kofi Annan?
I think using the word coward in relation to leaders who failed us, like Kofi Annan, is too soft a word. Let us remember what happened. The first mass murder of the 21st century took place on his watch. He is also the man who helped preside over the last two genocides last century, Rwanda and Srebrenica. It's right that primary accountability should be with the perpetrators, whether it was the genocidaires in Rwanda or the genocidaires in Sudan. And I don't think I'm here talking about moral equivalence of anything. But in my view, those who stand by and do nothing, and who just occupy their high office of trust, which the world has vested in them, and they fail that world, are almost as culpable as those who pull the trigger or stab you. Accountability is important for that type of person, like Kofi Annan, as much as it is for the genocidaires. Because if we don't have that accountability, then the rule of law is a joke. And situations like Rwanda and Darfur will keep on happening again and again and again. So I use the word coward in the sense that people in high office, like Kofi Annan, and not just him, but others around him, for example, the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Carin, and others who were around him, they were in positions where a word from them publicly, fearlessly, might have mediated the course of this conflict, which ultimately cost hundreds of thousands of lives. 4 million people are still suffering across the borderlands of Sudan. That's why we call this the world's most successful genocide. Even the Holocaust only lasted 6 years, though millions died. Even the Rwanda killings only lasted 100 days, though 800,000 died. The numbers in Darfur and Sudan are less, but in the history of genocide, spanning thousands of years, even before the word was invented, never have an atrocity period lasted as long as what's going on right now. So lack of accountability, lack of institutional courage, and the courage of the leaders who run these institutions is at the fundamental base of the impunity that underlies why these things happen again and again and again. This is why the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is very fashionable nowadays, is so hollow. And I call this responsibility to procrastinate, because effectively you are, the way the dogma of R2P works, you require the consent of the abusive state to stand aside and help protect, in a way, you see.
What could be done, if anything, to reinvigorate this principle of responsibility to protect?
Well,
Or give me an example. What could be done? What would it look like being implemented in Syria?
Well, I think let me start with the more general point, and that is that any principles or norms, like the responsibility to protect norm or any of the other aspirations, they're only as good as the international framework of laws and institutions and leaderships that we inhabit. What that means is that we have to recapture our United Nations and our global bodies, which were formed in good faith to protect the world and to take our collective world forward, our common human aspiration for decency and progress and equal humanity. So in a way, it's premature to talk about R2P. What we have to do is actually rediscover that international framework and reinvent our international institutions and ensure that we are well served by leaders of courage. If we do that, then the norms like R2P and others on development and other areas have a much better chance of actually having meaning and substance. To do this, and this is my final point on this, is that we need to fill the democratic gap between our global institutions and the global public. Remember the UN Charter, it starts off by those noble words, "We the peoples." And never have these global institutions, the higher you go up the global institutions, the further you are away from the people. And the reason there's growth of cynicism around the world, including here in Canada, about multilateralism, about the UN and elsewhere, is sadly because these institutions have detached themselves from the public, and public feels that they're not for them. We have to plug that gap, and if we do that, we might rediscover a new morality, a new ethics, a new cooperation, which is genuinely of universal merit and value to protect our peoples around the world.
Mukesh, you've written a book. The title of your book is Against a Tide of Evil. What similarities, differences do you see between your experience and response of the United Nations compared to Romeo Dallaire, the former United Nations force commander in Rwanda, who wrote the book Shake Hands with the Devil?
My book, Against the Tide of Evil, might be seen as a sequel to Romeo Dallaire's book. The tragedy is that if you read his book and you read my book, you will see so many similarities, except that we are separated by 10 years, and therefore, in a sense, it is a chronicle of failure to progress these norms. And that is the kind of the negative side of it. The positive side is that whereas in Dallaire's time, what happened was dark deeds happened in darkness, and he struggled and very bravely, almost single-handedly. In my time, 10 years later, chronicled in this book, Against the Tide of Evil, is that because it was happening in a globalized era, even in a remote, faraway place such as Darfur, we knew instantly. So I'm optimistic. My story is ultimately that one can make a difference if one speaks up, but connect with other people around the world, and we have the tools and technologies to ensure that no government, no genocidaire, no evildoer can get away with what they're doing in secret and in private, because you have the means to connect and make people aware and ultimately do something about it.
Well, Mukesh, thanks very much for joining us today. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did as well. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us again for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
And for once, the world was united in helping the two parties to come to a sensible resolution of the long-standing conflict. And I, as the head of the United Nations in the Sudan, was expected to help usher in a new chapter in Sudan's life, build peace and reconciliation, foster reconstruction, and then promote the development of this great land. Unfortunately, soon after I got there in April 2003, reality got in the way. And that new reality was the outbreak of war in a little-known region called Darfur. Darfur is the size of France. It's 1,000 kilometers or more west of Khartoum, and even at the best of times, somewhat forgotten. But it's
governance innovation. Today, we welcome Mukesh Kapila. Mukesh Kapila is a veteran of conflicts and disasters from Afghanistan to Bosnia, from Rwanda to North Korea, from Burma to Sierra Leone. He has been there, witnessing the worst that man and nature can do. Along the way, he has served in senior positions in the British government, in the United Nations, in the World Health Organization, and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations. This leads me to my first question. Mukesh, you were the top UN official, UN resident, and humanitarian aid coordinator in Sudan during the Darfur conflict. What did you find when you got there?
When I was appointed to be the
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak to Mukesh Kapila on Darfur and the situation in Sudan. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm CIGI Senior Fellow Carin, and I'm very happy to be this week's guest host. Every week we welcome an expert in international public policy, global governance, or some aspect of international affairs to the studio at the Center for International Governance.
It became clear to us that there was a new process going on there. A group calling themselves the Sudan Liberation Army had attacked government installations, the forces in Darfur. And before we know where we were, there was a major conflagration going on. This had a huge effect on the peace process and the original plan to settle the historic conflicts. When I investigated what was going on in Darfur, it was clear that this wasn't just another one of the numerous insurgencies that was troubling this land, and indeed the continent, but there were some very special features to it. The special features were that the Sudan government, led by al-Bashir, was orchestrating a genocidal solution to the UN chief of Sudan. The expectation was that I would be presiding or bringing peace to what was Africa's longest running conflict in the continent's biggest country at that time, and that had generated the world's largest numbers of refugees and displaced. Sudan had been at war within itself ever since it got independent in the 1950s. And over the long period, much suffering had taken place. But we had a historic opportunity in 2003 to bring that to the end, because the Islamic government in the north in Khartoum and the rebel movement in the south, led by John Garang, had fought themselves to a standstill.